Alright guys, time for a little more basic economics here, and this one is going to be on monopolies. I know I've discussed this a little bit in previous videos, but I want to give a good, clear-cut, direct link to point to people and say, here look, I did a video on monopolies. This is exactly my thoughts, why I think monopolies cannot exist perpetually without a state enforcing them. And here's my arguments where I'm going to explain why I think that is, and also give a detail of the conversations that I've had and what people seem to think is the reason that you need a government to stop monopolies. So here we go. Most people that I've had this conversation with that think you have to have a government to stop monopolies, it usually goes like this. Drew, you're crazy. Even if you don't think the government should run some sort of policing, if the government shouldn't run security services, if you think the government shouldn't run something like a military or national defense, even if you're going that far with your wacky libertarian ANCAP philosophy, you cannot possibly fail to understand why the tyranny that will ensue from corporations is going to be the exact same or even worse than you have with the government. That's normally what I hear. Now here's why I think that's dead wrong. First off, the idea of a corporation is a different entity than a big business. You see, a big business would just be a very successful firm. A corporation is actually granted a legal shield by the government. So corporations in and of themselves would not exist if it were not for government. Another thing, government is what keeps monopolies together because government rigs the game for giant industries. Even if you don't have direct monopolies, you have a bunch of special privileges that are granted to very large businesses going back all the way to the beginning, all the way to the start of government. I mean, even pre-American government, you had the kings imposing monopolies, granting special privileges and exclusive rights to create certain products or provide certain services to whoever they deemed to be the person they wanted to do those things for whatever various reasons they might have had. But monopolies trace back in this country all the way to the founding of this country. I mean, you had state-imposed monopolies going all the way back to the beginning. So unless you're trying to argue that mercantilism is a product of laissez-faire capitalism, which good luck with that because that makes no sense whatsoever, this has been going on since the beginning. In fact, there's a very good article called The Truth About Robber Barons that I'm going to include in the description box of this video. It's from the Mises Institute, and it is just very enlightening on all the mercantilism and shady dealings that created monopolies. But basically, you have government doing favors for certain businesses at the expense of other businesses. This reduces competition and makes it a lot harder for the little guy to compete with the big guy. This is why it's so interesting to me that progressives are the party of hiking up the minimum wage, regulating or increasing costs of doing business, which disproportionately impact the little guy. It fucks over the little guy way more than it hits Amazon or Walmart, who, by the way, lobby for minimum wage increases. They lobby for more regulations and more oversight from the government because it's not going to hurt them nearly as much as it's going to hurt the next Amazon or the next Walmart. So that is a distinction there between big businesses and corporations. So that's just one part of what we're going to talk about here. The other part that I want to talk about here is why I don't think a business or organization can create itself a monopoly without the coercive state imposing all these barriers to entry for all the competition, and also it just directly imposing and enforcing the monopoly and the cartel that forms to create the monopoly. And what we can do is we can look back into around the Civil War all the way through the Industrial Revolution up until the early 1900s, and we can see what's happened where hundreds of times where this was tried in several different industries, whether it was the railroads or if it was Standard Oil, if it was the steel industry, if it was all the different metal industries, every industry that this was tried on, and again, there are hundreds of examples of this, they failed every time before government got involved. And there's really two reasons why they fail. One, they have to have every other organization involved in the cartel that is trying to form the monopoly. They have to have everybody on board at all times. And there is incredible incentive for any business in that industry to undercut the rates of the rest of the businesses because they want to make money. If you can outbid your competitors or even the other members of your cartel, you can do it in secret for a long time until the secret gets out. And then your cartel crashes. these cartels start hating each other. They realize they can't cooperate with each other because everybody's trying to undercut everybody else, and the monopoly fails. This has happened hundreds of times. The other thing that happens is outside competition is constantly coming into the market. So when outside competition comes into a market that is forming its own monopoly, and by doing so, almost every time it is producing inefficiently and at higher costs than need be. So a business will normally try to get a product out or a service out at the lowest cost that they can to the consumer so that they can provide more of the service. So a new business coming in, trying to compete in the industry, has to be bought out by the monopoly. Now, it's possible to do that until you realize that this monopoly and this cartel will have to be perpetually buying out everyone who moves into the market. And they can't do this. This is a never-ending process of buying out competition, and that's just assuming that everybody is willing to sell. And again, the more people they buy out, the bigger the cartel would get, and the more people competing even within the cartel to make money will be. That's why it always fails until government gets involved. And look, I don't have credentials and degrees in economics. I'm not some professional who does this for a living. I just understand the arguments. And it's not that I don't know the arguments that progressives and left-wingers use about why we need a government to prevent monopolies. I'm well aware of their arguments. I just disagree with them. And I'm just some guy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a clip of the late, great Murray Rothbard explaining this. This is about 5 minutes long. But for anyone who's interested, this is a really great clip. If you want to hear more, there are hours and hours and hours and hours of content with Murray just talking about monopolies and cartels, let alone all the books he's written, all the audio books online. But here, I'm going to let the late, great Murray Rothbard take over here and explain the case.
By the end of the 19th century, business, first of all, was extremely competitive, all during the late 19th century. This is as a broad generalization. And prices were falling throughout. In other words, from the Civil War down to about 1900, late 1890s, prices were generally falling. And they were falling for good reason, namely that business was so competitive and the economy was so productive that the supply of goods and services was increasing at a rapid rate. In other words, that's when America industrialized. It was the biggest period of economic growth in the history of the world. And standard of living went up, and productivity went up, and prices fell. This did not mean that businesses were suffering, because costs were also falling as the productivity increased and mass production increased. So in this situation, the many business groups who tended to be inefficient try to correct this price falling situation by organizing cartels. In other words, by organizing a cartel of each industry so that they could cut production and raise prices. And this was tried in industry after industry, starting with the railroads, which were the first big business in the United States, first large-scale business, and continuing on through manufacturing by the late 1890s. Either trying through cartels, formal cartels, or through mergers. And in the late 1890s, the theory was, we'll just merge into we'll have one big firm for the entire steel industry, the oil industry, etc., and then we'll be able to cut production and raise prices and raise profits at the same time. So they tried this systematically. This was the ideology, so to speak, among businessmen, that the way to benefit for all of us is to have quotas, either formal quotas as in cartels or in mergers where you just agree that you'll have certain shares of this corporation, and then we'll cut production and raise prices. That was the great goal. All of this was a total flopperoo, and case after case, literally hundreds of cases of this kind of merger or cartel, they all flopped. And they flopped for two basic reasons. One is that an economic theory can predict this, and this is confirmed time and time again. Two basic reasons. One is, the basic reason is that the industry is free. Government did not step in and force people to accept the cartel or accept the merger. So what happens is that as soon as the cartel is formed or the merger is completed, and then they cut production and raise prices and profits go up, other businessmen come in and say, "Hey, this looks like a great industry here. The zinc industry or the oil industry or whatever, railroads. They're making a lot of profits. Let's nip in there and outcompete them because they're raising prices, and we're going to now come in with a new firm, a new factory, a new railroad." And we'll bust them, and that's exactly what happened. So you had new competition always coming in and outcompeting the older firms, and then the older firms are stuck with a new firm. Then you have a permanent competitor, which is a big pain in the neck as they come in with later equipment, with new factories and new equipment, the latest technology, etc. And now they have a permanent new competitor on their hands. So the whole thing became a big pain in the neck for them. And that's one reason. And then internally, what happened was that individual firms would start breaking the cartel and say, look, we've raised, in other words, the cartel restricts production, raises prices are very high, and then the individual firm says, look, I'm not supposed to do this because I have a cartel agreement with the rest of my buddies in the industry, but here's what we're going to do. For you, my old pal and drinking buddy or whatever, my buyer, I will sell you the steel or the whatever, titanium, etc., for 20% off list, provided you don't tell anybody about it. Okay, so what you have is a secret price cutting, and then this firm gains profits, gains sales, and of course the secret leaks out pretty quickly after about 6 months or a year, and then the other firms get very mad about this, and they call you your rate buster, which is in business terms is equivalent to scab in union terms, and the whole cartel falls apart with mutual recrimination and hatred, and they're back where they started, except now they've got more hatred than they had before. So in other words, this system didn't work. The cartel policy, the merger policy, flopped. And at that point, some of each step of the way, some of the more far-sighted in the sense of realizing this was a flop among the business groups, decided the only way to preserve a cartel or preserve a merger is to have the government enforce it. The turn of the political arm to create the cartel for you. And this was the origin of progressive regulation. The progressive system was not a group of far-sighted essentially, it was not a group of far-sighted intellectuals who sat around and said, we have to plan, we have to curb businessmen for the sake of the public interest. It was a groups of businessmen saying we have to impose cartels through the government, and thereby eliminating our competition, curbing the maverick firm which doesn't want to engage in a cartel, and gaining profits that way.